Hello everyone, Dr. Leitterman here, and I'm looking forward to showing you how to start your basic scrape on a reed that you've just tied. So you can see I've got my tools here, and I've got my knife, I've got my favorite ruler, I've got a pencil that I end up using towards the end of it. I have two plaques. I have my flat plaque here as well as my contoured plaque, and I'll show you how I use these in different ways. This is my cutting block. I have a razor blade that I will use, and of course the tied reed itself. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is grab my knife, and what I'm hoping to do is you'll see that I don't have any bark gone except for the bark that I took away when I finished tying this reed. But my goal is I need to get all the bark off, and I do that in a systematic way by creating what we call channels. So I'm going to be scraping right through the center here and the center here, and hoping to leave a spine in the middle of those two channels that I'm creating. I'm also paying attention to the outside, which we call the rails, so that I have just a little bit of bark here. And as I'm scraping these channels, I'll find that the bark will make its way off of the reed in the center where I'm creating the spine, and that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and you'll see my angle as I go through this. I'm going straight off the end of the cane, and I'm getting cane that is curling off, and I'm going all the way to the end of this reed so that I don't have a lot of cane built up on the end of the tip that I have to deal with later. And you can see I'm getting my way down the length of the reed, and again just going straight off, no special angles just yet, and you'll start to see that spine showing up. It still has a little bit of bark on it, so I'm going to keep working on this. If you start to have a spine that kind of looks like it's a scoliosis sort of spine and not straight, you can change that just by scraping and kind of guiding that spine to be a little bit cleaner and straighter. And so now I've got a reed with a nice spine, and you can see I didn't go all the way down to the thread. I'm not worried about getting a piece of cane or reed that goes all the way down to the thread, because frankly, when I do that, it's going to make a longer reed, so I'll have to fuss with it a little bit more. So this is about 3 or 4 millimeters from the thread, and that's fine with me. Different reed makers do it in different ways, so it's totally up to you, but I wouldn't recommend going all the way to the thread. So I'm going to turn over, and I'm going to do the exact same thing to the other side of the reed, just kind of working both sides of the reed as I work down to make these channels nice and long. And if you find that you're getting little nicks or little kind of places in the cane, like this right here, you can erase those. It seems kind of like a weird word to use, but you can see I'm going back and forth with that. That's me kind of erasing any of those impurities in the surface. There are some reed makers that absolutely love having nicks. I'm not necessarily one of them unless there's a reason. The nicks will tend to stop vibrations, and so if you have an overly vibrant reed, it's a great way to stop some of those vibrations. But at the very beginning, I don't want that. So you can see there's a nice little nick right there that I want to kind of get a handle on. And that seems to be much better. And you can see there's a nice strong spine in the center of it. And so that is my very first step when I am making a reed. All right, so the next step is actually going to involve my ruler and my pencil. This is where I like to make sure that I keep everything, all the variables from changing. And so I don't need to actually mark, but I want to make sure that when I start this read that I am for sure starting in the same spot. So that way I can eliminate, oh, well, I didn't scrape in the same spot each time. So I'm going to place my reed here, and on my ruler I have a specific spot that is, you can see is just a little bit darker right here, and that happens to be the spot that I really want to get a mark in. So I'm going to mark right at 66. That's that special mark on my ruler. And this specific spot I have chosen for a couple of reasons. So the big part of scraping the reed is that we are trying to make sure that we get the entire reed, the tip, the heart, and the back in balance with each other. And so depending on the length of each of these sections, tells us how thick or thin we need to make them in relation. So by keeping the same measurements, I'm going to be able to keep doing the exact same steps as I go through. So now that I have my mark, the next thing that I'm going to do is start scraping and creating what we call the V-line. So this right here is the bottom of the V-line. Everything above here, for the most part, is our tip. But the heart is in this part as well. So when I make this upside down V, or this triangle, this is a very important part of the heart, and we don't want to really take much cane off there. And so that's what I mean by making a V-line. We are going to scrape essentially around this triangle that I've just created. And so that means I need some interesting angles to work on that. So as I start, you'll see that I have an angle where I'm almost like scraping sideways. I'm exaggerating a little bit so you can see that, but I want to go all the way around the outside of this tip so that I get that to be thin, and some cane will come off this center. You'll see the triangle start to leave, but I'm keeping myself away from there as much as possible. So I'm going to get started, and I'm starting in what we like to call the corners. That's an important part to kind of get cane off of, and as I move around, I'm kind of going in what I like to kind of think of as like a half moon shape. So it won't be a strong V-line just yet. That comes later when I get to finishing, but it's going to start to show up in what I'm doing. And as I get this cane off, I'm going to want to bring the back and the heart, so all of this, into the tip. So I'm going to just do what I call dusting scrapes. But instead of going straight off like I did in the first step, I'm actually turning again like I did with the tip, so that I keep that motion and that cane knowing that I need to go off in that way. And so once my first side is completed, I'm going to go to my second side and do exactly the same thing. And you want to be careful up here, because this will start to get thin, and you want to make sure that you're getting the right amount of cane off and the right amount of right spots, because what's really common is to be digging in. I'm not pressing hard at all, but if you dig in, you might take off a huge chunk of the reed, and then you have to start over completely, and we don't want to do that. So again, just doing this dusting scrape to kind of bring the rest of the reed into this tip that I've started to create. And now I have the starting of my V-line. And I know it's not super easy to see, but it's starting to show up in this reed. And so we're now ready for the next step. Okay, so we have created our V-line and gotten that started, but the next step is actually to get this reed opened. So I'm going to grab my water cup and just dip this reed in there so that it has a little bit of water going on. If you scraped a reed, let it sit for a while, you'll definitely want to do this because you can really have some cracking happening. I just tied this, so I was ready to go right away. But I'm gonna grab my cutting block, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip the very tip off of this reed. While I'm doing that, there's a couple ways that people like to do it. A lot of people do it this way, but what I don't like is I cannot see what is being cut off. So I actually turn it towards me so that I can really see what's going on. And I'm gonna show you exactly how much to cut off. So I'm gonna turn this around just so that you, the viewer, can see, but it's not really a lot. It's just enough to get this clipped open. And if you did your job well enough in the last step, you'll be able to just pull that reed away. And you can see I've now got my reed that is open. There's a little bit of an opening right there, and that is how much I took off. Okay, so we've now got our reed open, and we're actually going to go back and do the exact same step as far as the V-line is concerned. So I'm gonna actually add my line back onto this reed, and that's so I just remember where I'm at. I can probably see it, but you know, better safe than sorry, just in case. And so now I'm actually going to be grabbing my plaque so that I am ready to get this inside here. So I'm going to be very careful and put this in just in between the blades. I'm going to go about halfway in. One thing about using the contoured plaque, which is my favorite plaque to use, is you don't want to leave it inside the blades too long because it will make the blades do that. So I'm also going to dip this in my water just once more so that I'm sure that it is ready to go. And like I said, I'm just repeating that last step. So I'm scraping right here at the corners and getting all of this cane off. And that clicking sound is actually pretty important, tells you a lot, tells you that the tip is very thick. If it's not super thick, it will not click like that. So the tip is, of course, the thinnest part of the reed, and so you don't want a very loud clicking sound to be happening. So I'm fixing that. Again, keeping mindful of that triangle that we created so that the heart, that top part of the heart, just under the V-line, can do its job, which is to help give some strength and stability to this reed. So I'm finished with that V-line again. I'm just doing some dusting scrapes, getting the reed reconnected into the tip as I've been working on, grabbing the corners right here, and I'm gonna turn it over and go to the second side. So here is, again, working on that tip, getting as much cane off as I can, but I don't want to make this tip super thin because if I do that, my second day of making this reed will not go well because I won't have a reed that's as stable as I would like, because I'm gonna have to make sacrifices in other sections to make sure it does what I need. So again, just going ahead and getting this cane, getting the tip into the heart and back right now, and I am ready to test this reed. Okay, so you can see I've grabbed my tuner and I'm ready to see if this is going to make a sound. The nice thing is the opening is looking pretty good, which means it's definitely going to do something. It may not be the final product, but I'm not looking for the final product. So let's see what this does. Yeah, so it's doing exactly what I'm expecting. It's not crowing what we call crowing a C. It's crowing a B, and that's okay. It's also pretty raucous, which is good. That's telling me that the reed is going to have some vibrations going through it, so it means that I can calm those vibrations down and get a stable reed, as opposed to going the other way, which usually is much harder to get a finished reed out of. So one thing I should talk about with you is how to crow a reed. It's not always taught, and so this is the perfect opportunity to do it. So you're going to place the reed all the way in your mouth, all the way to the thread, and you're going to slowly blow, and you should hopefully get a whimper. That whimper I'm getting without blowing hard. I'm just blowing a little bit of air. So that tells me that it's vibrating well. Now this is going to change because I'm going to do some things with the actual reed that's going to make it difficult. And so we're going to go back and forth. But once I've done that, I'm going to slowly add pressure and see if I can get a C. So I'm a very sharp B, which means that's a good thing. I'm very close. But it's not a C yet. And I should add that I'm blowing just like I would play. So you notice I'm grabbing my cutting block, and that's because if it's flat, clipping a little bit off is actually going to make it sharper. So I'm going to find this, get it clipped, and you can see on my razor blade how much I took off. Not much at all. And now we should be close to a C. So close. It's a little bit of a flat C, so I'm going to take just a little bit more. You can see there it is on my razor blade right there. And now you can see I'm kind of putting it in my mouth and wetting it before I crow so I get an accurate crow. And that gives me the C I'm looking for. Okay, so the final step we're going to do before we set it aside for the day is we're going to actually mark where we have the top of the back and the bottom of the heart. And that marking for me is at 60. That's a pretty common measuring place for most people. The measure of 66 for the top of bottom of my V line is kind of high for a lot of people, but that's because I know that that line is going to move down as I'm making a reed, and I want the final place of that bottom of the V line to be 64 or 65. So I mark a little bit above, knowing that it's going to migrate down. So now that I've got this marked, my next thing to do is go ahead and scrape just a few scrapes. We don't want too many off the back. And it's, again, like we were doing the channel, so just straight up, no angles at all. And I'm stopping right at that line. Some people will create some nicks at that line. Again, the more nicks, the more stopping of the vibrations that we're going to have. So it's up to you. I keep it pretty smooth unless I find that it's too vibrant, and that can be one way I can fix that. So I'm going to check this reed. It still crows a C. So I'm going to set this aside for the day and come back to it tomorrow and start honing in and doing the finishing touches to the reed.